Ja, hi, mein Name ist Ingmar Krusch, bin Teamleiter hier bei Evolution Iterating im Operations-Bereich, wie wir es so neudeutsch nennen, also im IT-Betrieb bei uns. Ihr könnt mich auf Google Plus oder Twitter circlen, adden, followen, wie auch immer. Ich will ein bisschen über Continuous Delivery bei Mobilen Scout 24 reden, aber mehr wie wir dahin gekommen sind, also wie unser Weg aussah und nicht einfach nur so ist es jetzt und das war übrigens auch total easy und weil wir so super cool waren, sondern ich will ein bisschen mehr so versuchen, eine Inside-Story zu erzählen, was für Schritte wir genommen haben, um dahin zu kommen, wo wir jetzt sind. Bitte. Yes, no problem. I prepared it in English, okay. So it's no problem. Okay. No problem. Okay. So, did you understand what I was saying before? Or should I repeat? You catch up. Okay. Okay, you're welcome. Okay. When we started with changing the way we were deploying our portal, the operations team was basically running at capacity and in some cases above capacity with what we were doing as an IT as a whole. So the initial scope of what we tried to do with deployment was to get to a sustainable pace at work and operations in regard to deployment. I'm not talking about everything, but in regard to deployment. We weren't even thinking about continuous delivery at that point in time, but when we really started with this in 2009, we were thinking about deployment only of what we had. And what we had on our hands is called like this. Usually this is used as a curse. So we had a lot of historically grown code, meaning our application, meaning our deployment tool, and we had a lot of really grown infrastructure. We started in '97, way back then, before the big bubble burst. And of course a lot of know-how has left the company, people got new jobs and took the know-how of this custom built solution with them. And also at that time in 2009, development and operation was pretty much siloed in. So there was little understanding in the development team what operation was doing all day long, and the other way around was also true. And the result was that we had a separate tooling for deployment, we had separate infrastructure that we were deploying to in operations and in development, although at the end it was running on the same set of physics, but we didn't know how development was doing its stuff, and operations was also like this. And there was basically some collaboration, but it was really minimal. So this resulted in a very little transparency in our IT department. We also outsourced the handling of our data centers. We run 2 data centers in Berlin and Hamburg. And on these 2 data centers we run shy of 1,000 virtual machines. And this, by 2009, this was completely outsourced to a data center partner. And of course the result of this is that the know-how for maintaining and creating these kind of infrastructure was also outsourced, because our data center partner was doing it. It was not us that is doing it, and if you do this for 5-6 years, you don't have this kind of know-how anymore. so that is why root, we didn't have any root access at this time to our own data centers, but our data center partner had root. And we only had a limited web admin account, which was working well at this time because the only thing that we were doing was deploying our application to a running virtual machine, and if we wanted a new virtual machine, ticketing system, waiting a day, and that was. But the business that we are running here at Immobilien Scout 24 did change back then already and has only accelerated today. So what we are how we wanted to develop our business was about to change, and it basically wanted to go faster and be more flexible. And so we as an IT had to go faster and be more flexible with our infrastructure, with our deployment, how we develop our application and so on. And by 2009 we had already changed our methodology to Scrum and Kanban in development, and the cool thing happened that it really switched gears and changed speed that was coming from the development department on our portal. It was really great. But this, of course, is a challenge if your deployment infrastructure didn't live up to the task to be also that flexible and fast, or if you're not able to change it that fast. And so we basically had a sense that we really needed to change something significantly.
Who exactly was the one who said, okay, we need to change? Was it on the ops part? Really on the business part, which I cannot mention, or
for the deployment part?
No, for like okay, you saw something's going wrong here. You need to go. You do more.
Okay,
DevOps or
this was obvious to anyone because this was obvious because it took a very long time to deploy a major release of our portal.
People get
and
used to
it was
everything, so.
always a hassle to even get to a build of our next version, because the build of our software was also historically grown, right? And so we just felt the pain that we needed to change something. There didn't need to be someone deciding that we had to change, but it was obvious.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
No, really, no. Because I mean, Windows users also getting used to things, and so does the business. So someone or like was it more coming from the technical, from the ops or dev team?
It was coming from everywhere.
I see it's very often that this comes from the technology teams. But you said also like the business was demanding it. Is it?
There were on the one hand a lot of people pushing for change to happen, and there was also management seeing that there had to be a change in how we were doing things. But as Christian said, that this was not only management, this was IT staff, and business was, as business always is, why it is taking so damn long. I can do this in front page at the weekend, so you always have this notion, right?
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Better answer?
Yeah, I get it.
Okay. So, as I just said, without everyone pushing us, we already knew it, but people were pushing. And to be quite honest, I was among one of those who were pushing at that time. And so, as I said, we were thinking about changing our deployment, and on top of that, our top management, our CTO, decided on a new IT vision. And this was continuous deployment, really, not just continuous delivery, but it was continuous deployment. He wanted to have every feature that was completed live within a single day. So this was his vision for the IT. So suddenly we didn't have only to think about deployment, but we had to think about at least continuous delivery to even get to continuous deployment. So it's fair to say that the crown was changing beneath us while we were thinking, or while we were trying to figure out how we should tackle deployment even. There were also some IT-wide changes going on while we were thinking about deployment. Like I said, the build of our application was also historically grown. So at that time, we as an IT changed the build of our application to Maven 2, and we modularized our application. It is still now a very big monolith, but it was even worse in 2009. And this really resulted in a lot of uncertainty because we didn't know what was changing next, even though in the end this was really helpful to have a Maven 2 build instead of this historically grown and thing that was building our application. So in a nutshell, this is how our deployment and build infrastructure looked like at the end of 2009. And I bet even some colleagues felt like this. And I also bet some colleagues felt like this, because if it's really complex, there's also a lot of cool stuff that you can do with it. I think it's Indiana Jones, but this was already pretty bad to have this kind of technical stuff before you. But the real dilemma was that we were also divided amongst ourselves on really how to tackle this. There were we couldn't really agree on what the best approach was, either to just do a clever arding of our application to our servers and keep a lot of stuff in place, or if we fundamentally had to change our concept to get this working. If you really disagree on what fundamental direction to take, sometimes it's best to just try something out. And in our case, we decided to try out several things. And the perspective I'm taking this from is from one of the guys who participated in one particular proof of concept on how to deploy things. So I try to develop the story from this angle, and I want to do this because I want you to have a sense of the circumstances that we came up with our solution under. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of long discussions without an agreement at the end. So sometimes really you need to just stop talking and show that something is working, and so we did. With several, we had 4 proof of concepts that we were doing. And for you to understand the first iteration that we did, I want to explain briefly how the deployment worked that we started with. As I said, we had some build and release process, and this was creating a proprietary package format. We still call it deployment unit, which is really a glorified zip file. And it gets a version number, and we put it on a file share, and we have some, in 2009 we had some configuration mean that was already versioned in a subversion, but in the end we exported this also to a file share. And so our deployment tool took these two parts, if I can abstract it to this, and deployed it on a virtual machine in our data center. While this looks really simple, remember this is really how it looked like. And coming up with an idea to fundamentally change the way we were deploying application, how we were building our systems. I also bet some felt like Wally tasked with cleaning up the waste-covered earth all by himself. So the first iteration really was to just take the way that we built our application and run with this. Don't go there changing this. The other thing we decided was to just not really scrap, but take the way we configure our system into a next iteration. And the other thing we decided is to scrap the way we deploy our system. So as I said, this proprietary deployment or this proprietary packaging format, we kept that, and we wrote a clever script that converted this zip file into an RPM package. And as you do with RPM package, you put it in a Yum repository. In the first iteration, we had a single global repository where we put our application RPMs. And we expanded on the idea of having our configuration in a subversion, but not just for versioning, but for modeling our landscape. And I will go into a little bit detail for that, but basically this was our configuration model. And so if you check something in, we wrote ourselves a post-commit hook which took the model and created a configuration RPM out of this model for the host that we had. So if we have 100 hosts, there was 100 configuration RPMs created, one for each host. And of course, this also goes in the single global Yum repository. And if you want to install this application, well, you do a Yum install on your system. So this was really the basic idea of deploying your application and your configuration as RPM packages. And because this at that time this was really a fundamental change on how we package, on how we configure. Before we just had the plain configuration file in a file system, just can look at the files and see exactly how the configuration is. And now we have it in a subversion as a model. We wrote ourselves a web application to look at the final result of the configuration. So we had a config viewer where you can see how the configuration would look in the end. The configuration that we do in the subversion, as I said, is a model. So if you have 100 virtual machines and if you have 2 stages, development, testing and production, you model this landscape in your SVN. So there are configuration that only applies to the development stage, and there is configuration that only applies to these 20 hosts, because these 20 hosts are for one application and another 20 hosts are for another application, but in the testing stage. So this is the model of our complete landscape that we run our web portal. And then you generate one config RPM for each host. And so the config RPM really says, I'm the configuration for a specific host. I hope this is readable. Okay. You really create an individual configuration for each and every host. And what the configuration says is, you're an application server, or you're a database, or you are a web server, or what have you. We use RPM dependencies a lot. So what gets generated in the config RPM is an RPM that has a normal RPM dependency on the application package. This is not inside the config RPM, but it's an RPM dependency, a metadata of the RPM package. And of course, if you deploy the application, say it's a tomcat application, it needs a tomcat to run on. And the application says through an RPM dependency, I am the tomcat application, please install a tomcat so I can run. And basically what you had to do to deploy any host, you deploy the host config RPM on the host and are finished, because everything else gets pulled in by RPM dependencies.
Sorry.
You're welcome.
The picture before the first iteration was looking a lot cleaner. So, so what have you achieved with the first iteration? So, because I think there was something in there that I haven't seen for now.
You
not this picture. No, without the background. That's the, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but the background is the picture.
Okay.
Okay. If I would want to explain how the whole deployment worked, would take half the day.
Ah, okay. So there was not one config share as displayed here. You had different points, maybe. Or
okay. Maybe the example for the configuration. We have at that time 700, 600 virtual machines when we started with this.
Okay.
And you had in the configuration for web servers, you had 50 releases, history of the configuration change in one config file. So you could see in this one config file, this was the configuration for release 50, and this was the configuration for release 51, and the one was commented out, and the other one was working, and maybe you didn't comment it out, but overrode it later in the file.
okay.
And there was a lot of copy and paste in it, and this really was maintainable.
The really good thing we achieved with the new way was that you have a new naked machine and you just install one package and you get all this dependency to a running machine.
Okay.
Here you have an already running machine and you just want to change the configuration or to deploy a new release. But maybe application manager had to set up this machine for 2 days or so. Yeah, there were no automatization with that. There was no only automatization for the deployment for config and deployment units.
Okay.
So this is a bit out of this picture, but it was a daily business and it was really pain in the ass.
Okay. Yeah, basically the context is continuous deployment, right? So before you get a ticketing system and you make your changes and yourself make your changes, and stuff was breaking all the time and you didn't understand why it was breaking, and worse of all, you couldn't do anything about it because this deployment solution really had passed as not only its end of service but its end of life, right? So you couldn't really just roll out the portal to a new country like we did with Austria. Because you could already say, okay, this is a 2-year project just to get that what we have now deployed to another country.
Okay.
So
most of the errors in these pictures are automated and they weren't before, maybe. Right. Okay.
The first iteration was to convert what we had into an RPM package and deploy that. So for the second iteration, we just dropped the conversion of an old application and just start with building an application as an RPM from scratch. And what we took was a simple fairly simple tomcat application and automated the build from the ground up. And the tomcat application we took was a Solr search service engine thingy, which basically is a tomcat application with an HTTP interface. And what this application does is it reads our listings from the database, and if the database is there, the index gets updated, and if it's not there, it grows old, and if the database is there again, it updates again. Right, so nicely decoupled from the database. And our portal application, our backend system, was using this search index for full text search on our portal. And just for completeness, through a web server, this is in a load balancer, and you can surf our website and use this feature. So we didn't have to think about this at all in the second iteration, because it was decoupled by an HTTP call, and if the backend couldn't reach the Solr service, the feature just disappeared from the portal, and if the system was reachable again, the feature was visible at the portal again. So we didn't have to think about this at all. And we also didn't have to think about the database, because it was also decoupled. So we just focused on deploying this one very well designed Solr application and just build it as an RPM. And what we did is we took 1 week together with an operations team and a development team, put them in one room on around one table, and had them work out a solution for deploying their own application together with us. And the week after that, we agreed on a date when to go live with this. So the first thing we had to do is move from this laboratory environment where we converted the application to a real infrastructure. And we had to agree with our data center provider to change a lot of stuff on the system, because we had our own YAML repository that we wanted to connect with it, and we had to change the sudo rights on the system, because we don't got root, but we got this web admin account. So there was a lot of things that we needed to do to a machine to be able to deploy an RPM on it, because to deploy an RPM, you need to do this as root, or at least do yum install with something, and we couldn't before. So we had to agree with our data center provider about this, and this was really a little bit tricky, because it touched contractual relationship with our data center provider. And the hard thing, or the hard part about this, was that we were a little bit divided on the question whether we needed to have this conversation at all, because we just could do a clever thing and be done with it. But we were thinking we had to fundamentally change the way we were doing, so this was a little bit touchy back then. So the second iteration with the Solr application, we just stayed with the configuration meme in the subversion where we create RPMs. Now we don't only have this one machines, but we have several machines in several stages. We have the development stage, we have the testing stage, and TUV stands for Test und Verifikation. So we have our testing stage, and we have our 2 data centers in Berlin and Hamburg. And so just for this simple application, I think it was 10 virtual machines to have just this one application running on in different stages. And the application was already built in TeamCity, and we just used the Maven build that was already there, and used the RPM plugin to just create an RPM package from this one single WAR file that was the application. It was fairly straightforward. And we used the Maven release process to create one snapshot RPM and one release RPM, and the snapshot RPM we deployed on our development stage, and the release RPM we deployed on testing and production. So this was basically the first iteration, and my advice really, or my learning from this is incorporate everyone in this who wants to incorporate. As I said, in this time we were a little bit divided on what the right approach was, and one colleague came to us and wanted to participate in our proof of concept to really had another idea on what to do. And at first I was a little bit skeptical if this really could work well, but the end result was really great, and I'm so happy that we managed to work together in this really DevOps fashion that I would strongly recommend this. Whoever wants to help you, let them help you, even if they, or especially when they disagree with you. When we had built our application for the development and the test stage, we just wrote a cron job which run every minute that just did a sudo yum upgrade on the system. And so if you check in any changes to the configuration or to your application, it gets built, and 1 minute later it gets deployed on your development stage. This worked pretty good, and we also experimented with func and control tier deployment tools. I don't really want to go into these, but we experimented with them quite a lot. But in the end, really, we stayed with the cron job, and for the production system, we just opened a shell and automated this by hand, rolling out a new version. For the and we went live with this application, and lo and behold, it worked. Right. So for the third iteration, we were combining two proof of concepts. This one that I just explained, and another one that I will explain next. And for this combination, we kept the configuration as RPM, we kept the Maven release process, we scrapped all these experiments with rolling out our RPMs to our systems. And the other proof of concept is called Yacht. At that time it meant yet another deployment tool, and was one of the 4 proof of concept that we were doing at this time. And what Yacht did back then was take the configuration from the share, from the file share that we have, and take the build, the proprietary build of our application, and the project came up with a new concept of modeling a service running on a system. So in Yacht you have a Solar service that runs on a system, and it explicitly models this service. And the other concept is a service configuration that is defined as part of this configuration, and the third thing is an artifact, basically a WAR file for your tomcat application. And it combines all these 3 things into a dependency model. And from this model, Yacht knows if you change your configuration or if you change your application, it has to stop your service, deploy it, and start it again, because it knows the dependency. If this changes, this service is impacted, and so I have to do it. And it also knows the order of actions that you need to do. So stopping goes first, then comes deployment, then comes starting. And if you have a lot of services and a lot of hosts, it knows the order from which service on which host. And this is the dependency model that Yacht introduced into our thinking of deployment. And deploying was basically an rsync. So this was the one school of thought that you do a really clever rsync, but to do minimal changes to your infrastructure and just be clever on how you use it. As I said, we were combining, so we scrapped the config share keeping, and we also had to skip this service configuration because we already had this configuration per host meme working, and we didn't want to invest so much time getting to a working solution, so we just decided to drop that also. But this is a great idea, and we will introduce it again, but it takes time. And we dropped the proprietary format for RPM packaging, and of course, if you have RPMs, you don't rsync, but you yum upgrade or yum install. And we kept Yacht, and we kept this dependency model, and we kept these artifacts as our application packages and the service. So the first complete solution, we have the configuration and our main release process, and we have this unified dependency tree. And instead of defining this explicitly, we just use what RPM gives you. You have dependencies, and you can use these dependencies. If you model your service and you say you depend on this RPM, you have this connection. So this was a pretty small interface that we had to change to really combine these two approaches. And of course, we dropped func and control tier and this cron job and everything else, and use Yacht to deploy our changes to our complete data center. Yeah, and what Yacht basically does is stopping a service, starting a service, updating, and querying the system for the status. So, are you up to date? Is your services running, and so on. There's what Yacht does in the end to the system is just that, nothing more. But it does it in a very clever way.
Sorry, is that only for one server, or it does calls to all the servers which are in the dependency list?
Okay, what if you have 100 systems and you have dependencies between these 100 systems, right? And these 100 systems are our web portal. Then Yacht knows if you have an update to your application which affects half of your servers, that it has to stop the services running on these systems, deploy to these 50 servers, and start the services again. And if Yacht figures out, because it knows all these dependencies, that only one system is affected, it just does this for this one system. Is this the answer you were looking for?
It's also like get out the dependencies and then deploy them first. So it's like orchestrating.
Yeah, right. This is the problem with all the deployment tools who are all, out there. They only focus on the server, and RPM works fine if you focus on the server. But if you have dependencies like disabling this service in the load balancer and disable the monitoring while the deployment time that you can't get false alarms or so. And there's no tool out there doing that, so we did it ourselves.
And this is the Yacht tool.
And that's
Right.
what we are doing.
So
Not only status or start-stop, but independent or the models of the UDP,
Unified Dependency Tree.
Forms our whole complexity, which is necessary to make automatization. All this were manual steps before. You know, it was a lot of wiki lists and to just make just mark and do it. You need such a tool for automatization.
So basically, what I don't have the time to show this, but the interface is really a shell, and what you type in 2 words and hit return, and the 2 words is Yacht update, and then Yacht figures out what to do with your 100 servers, and if it figures nothing to do here, it does nothing, and it figures out deploying everything, it is just that. But the only thing that we model is this is the service running here, and basically everything else is computed from the RPM dependencies. So Yacht builds up an action plan of what to do, which service to stop, which service to start, which system to update, and what is the order between these tasks.
Sorry. It means Yacht is a single process running on a single machine that talks to everybody else.
Yacht is using SSH, so you can. It works if you if you do it from your workstation, which has SSH access to your machines, or we use in production we use jump hosts a lot. So you log into the jump host, and we have host-based authentication from the jump host to all the systems. So you just have to log on to the jump host, and then you can.
But it's especially a single process. It's not a distributed application with. So there's nothing running on the target machines.
It's clientless.
Yeah. Okay.
So Yacht. Yacht does does as much things in parallel as it can, but it's doing this from one host, so that the Yacht itself is not distributed, but it does things in parallel.
How is Yacht related to configuration management tool like Decoupled, where you can also model actions that need to be done on updates?
It's only on one machine. The updates are only done on one machine. You have no possibility to say to Decoupled, please disable me in the load balancer and wait till this nature check is red, and then you can update me, or something like this. And this is dependency models like we have it, and we have to implement it in any way. So there's only a few on the server. If you have Puppet or Chef, you only have a few on the server, and the orchestration has to be done outside from any other tool. And don't have such a tool. I don't know about such a tool.
And adding to this, there are 2 tasks. One is, or at least 2, but one is managing the files on a single server, your application files, the WAR file for this tomcat application, and your configuration files. And bringing these files to a Linux system, we use YAM and RPM because this is the way you deploy things, or you install things on a Red Hat or on a SLES or every RPM based system. So the one task is updating the files on the system, configuration, everything. And the other thing is in which order do I have to do this across 100 machines, and what updates do I have to call? And the latter part is what we do with Yacht, and the first part is what we do with YAM and RPM. And the modeling of the configuration is in the config subversion that we use. Does this answer your question?
I guess you're going to have like a big amount of config and application RPMs. I mean, are you handling the repository with some tools or everything on shell scripts?
Are you talking about the upload or
I'm
the?
talking about the directory which is hosted on a server with all the RPMs. I got in a situation where we got like this amount of RPMs spreading up and handling as well the index recreation by hand was all better.
Okay. We basically have quite a lot repositories. We have this global repository still, with basically has our configuration, and the old applications that we started with also have the RPMs in there, and sure it gets big, but not vastly huge. And we have a Nexus artifact repository for our Java application build, and we wrote a plugin to access our Nexus repository as Yum repositories. So every artifact repository that we have in Nexus, you can also access this as a Yum repository. And so there are a lot of repositories. A repository for release 50, for release 51, for 52, for this stuff, for this other stuff, for the staging activity I'm just working on. So there are a lot of repositories, and we also have several others. So basically we try to cut our repositories so that they don't get this big.
Right, but like the overall amount of all the repositories is handled as normal storages, or you have a web application?
File system.
File system, that's it, okay.
Just repo create. And
yeah, that's what the question is.
Okay. Okay, I already said this. When we got this first complete version going, the next iteration that we were doing was Opensourcing Yacht. And you can find it on google.com. And to be honest, not everyone was agreeing that open sourcing our deployment solution should really be a priority, because this is a lot of work, open sourcing a project that you start to build for yourself, because there are a lot of specific dependencies or assumptions that you make that only apply to you and your infrastructure. So this was a lot of work, open sourcing it, but I still think this was a good priority to have, because it made our code better. It made it into a product really, so it's installable, it's documented, so someone else who's not working here can understand it, which makes your application better. And it got a pretty good test coverage, and this really, for me in retrospect, was worthwhile open sourcing. And more importantly than that, really, in my perspective, is that you get feedback as an engineer on what you are doing if you open source it, if you talk about it. And for me, this is really valuable as an engineer.
Are you afraid of giving your secret source to the outside world, so everybody can now be installed, something like that?
Yeah, no, we're not.
Cool.
My thinking about this is that this makes for a more attractive job that we have as engineers at now. And you, I think the main thing about open sourcing for us as a company is we're interested in having people who can build these kind of solutions, but we're not really interested in having the solution, because just having any clever solution doesn't help you in the long run, but having people who can build such stuff is really helpful for you as a company. And as I said, I think the product is better, and you get better ideas that you can put into your product, and we collaborate with others who use this product, and this also makes this product better. And if we don't open source this can't happen. So no, I'm not afraid of this at all. That's why I made it a priority in my project. When the solar application is really a nicely decoupled application, this is really great. And if you have a DevOps mindset and if you use modern techniques, nowadays it's really quite doable to get to a simple application that is not complex, has no hard dependencies on anything. It's for a small new application, you can get there fairly easily. But splitting up your legacy application is really hard. To be honest, we tried and failed 2 times splitting up our core application that we started developing in the 90s. And this will really be quite challenging to deploy this huge, tightly coupled web application with Yacht. Because one thing about our application is that the old stuff is stateful. So if we want to deploy our backend systems, we first have to wait 30 minutes till the sessions all time out. Then we can shut down the system, we can deploy it, and we fire it up again, and then it takes 10-20 minutes for the caches to heat up. The solar application starts in a couple of seconds and it stops even faster. So it's no problem running a wave deployment over 100 machines. This is really no issue. But if each node that you are taking does take you 40 minutes to take care of, is really working and it's really up again, this will be a challenge. The fourth iteration really was kicking the Maven release process. And as you see there, the Maven release process is really crap. So we just dropped it completely. For everything that we do new, there are still applications that are built by this, and we're working to get this legacy cleaned up. But really the problem about the Maven release process is that you create two versions of the same application. One version is called snapshot, and the same right, is packaged again as a release artifact. And so if you want to deploy this as an RPM, and when we deploy only the configuration, we need to have a dependency to either the snapshot or the release RPM. And so we have different configuration on different systems. And this is really, it's not helping. And if you talk to people who use the Maven release process, most of them tell you don't do it. Second this notion. But it was a good first iteration on building our application because we knew how to do it, and this took us half a day or a day to get this working. So as a first operation, this was good because it was easy and we got it done fast. But what we changed was that we only wanted to package the application once and move it between the stages. So we stayed with building the application in TeamCity as an RPM with the Maven RPM plugin, and we created a new development repository, and we uploaded the repository in this the package in this repository and connect it to only your development stage. And so if you build a new application, your development stage sees it and can upgrade to the new version. And if you're done testing and being happy about what you built, you promote it to a second repository, the testing repository, again, test and verification repository. And this repository is connected to your testing stage. And so after you promote it, Yacht sees that there is a new version and you can install it on testing. And since we want to have our repositories clean and small, we don't copy it, but we move it. And to not confuse Yum about having an RPM installed that it doesn't see in a repository, we also connect the dev stage to the testing repository, so it sees the RPM again that it has installed. And so this is just to not confuse Yum. And if you test it again and do all your system checks and everyone is still happy with this build, you promote it to the production repository, and we just reused our global repository for this. And again, since we copy, we do not copy but move, we also connect the global repository to everything. And for me, having this kind of infrastructure is obviously good because we can skip the Maven release process. This is you can easily automate this, but really this was for me a victory for the DevOps mindset, because the first iteration we built with development and operations together, and this package promotion pipeline was built by a development team, and they really also thought that the Maven release process was crap, and they decided to do something about it. And basically, we just had to enable them to do it. And for me, this is really one of the benefits. So have the RPMs in there, and sure, it gets big, but not vastly huge. And we have a Nexus artifact repository for our Java application build, and we wrote a plugin to access our Nexus repository as Yum repositories. So every artifact repository that we have in Nexus, you can also access this as a Yum repository. And so there are a lot of repositories. A repository for release 50, for release 51, for 52, for this stuff, for this other stuff, for the staging activity I'm just working on. So there are a lot of repositories, and we also have several others. So basically we try to cut our repositories so that they don't get this big.
Right, but like the overall amount of all the repositories is handled as normal storages, or you have a web application?
File system.
File system, that's it, okay.
Just repo create. And
Yeah, that's what the question is.
Okay. Okay, I already said this. When we got this first complete version going, the next iteration that we were doing was Opensourcing Yacht. And you can find it on google.com. And to be honest, not everyone was agreeing that open sourcing our deployment solution should really be a priority, because this is a lot of work, open sourcing a project that you start to build for yourself, because there are a lot of specific dependencies or assumptions that you make that only apply to you and your infrastructure. So this was a lot of work, open sourcing it, but I still think this was a good priority to have, because it made our code better. It made it into a product really, so it's installable, it's documented, so someone else who's not working here can understand it, which makes your application better. and it got a pretty good test coverage, and this really for me in retrospect was worthwhile open sourcing. And more importantly than that, really in my perspective, is that you get feedback as an engineer on what you are doing if you open source it, if you talk about it, and for me this is really valuable as an engineer.
And you're afraid of giving your secret source to the outside world, so everybody can now be Kingpin scouts or something like that.
Yeah, no, we're not.
Cool.
My thinking about this is that this makes for a more attractive job that we have as engineers at Kingpin Scout, and you, I think the main thing about open sourcing for us as a company is we're interested in having people who can build these kind of solutions, but we're not really interested in having the solution, because just having any clever solution doesn't help you in the long run, but having people who can build such stuff is really helpful for you as a company. And as I said, I think the product is better, and you get better ideas that you can put into your product, and we collaborate with others who use this product, and this also makes this product better. And if we don't open source this can't happen. So no, I'm not afraid of this at all. That's why I made it a priority in my project. When the solar application is really a nicely decoupled application, which is really great. And if you have a DevOps mindset, and if you use modern techniques, nowadays it's really quite doable to get to a simple application that is not complex, has no hard dependencies on anything. It's for a small new application, you can get there fairly easily. But splitting up your legacy application is really hard. And to be honest, we tried and failed 2 times splitting up our core application that we started developing in the 90s. And this will really be quite challenging to deploy this huge, tightly coupled web application with Yacht, because one thing about our application is that the old stuff is stateful. So if we want to deploy our backend systems, we first have to wait 30 minutes till the sessions all time out. Then we can shut down the system, we can deploy it, and we fire it up again, and then it takes 10-20 minutes for the caches to heat up. The solar application starts in a couple of seconds, and it stops even faster. So it's no problem running a wave deployment over 100 machines. This is really no issue. But if each node that you are taking does take you 40 minutes to take care of, is really working and it's really up again, this will be a challenge. The fourth iteration really was kicking the Maven release process. And as you see there, the Maven release process is really crap. So we just dropped it completely. For everything that we do new, there are still applications that are built by this, and we're working to get this legacy cleaned up. But really the problem about the Maven release process is that you create two versions of the same application. One version is called snapshot, and the same is packaged again as a release artifact. And so if you want to deploy this as an RPM, and when we deploy only the configuration, we need to have a dependency to either the snapshot or the release RPM. And so we have different configuration on different systems. And this is really, it's not helping. And if you talk to people who use the Maven release process, most of them tell you don't do it. Second this notion. But it was a good first iteration on building our application because we knew how to do it, and this took us half a day or a day to get this working. So as a first operation, this was good because it was easy and we got it done fast. But what we changed was that we only wanted to package the application once and move it between the stages. So we stayed with building the application in TeamCity as an RPM with the Maven RPM plugin, and we created a new development repository, and we uploaded the repository in this the package in this repository and connected to only our development stage. And so if you build a new application, your development stage sees it and can upgrade to the new version. And if you're done testing and being happy about what you built, you promote it to a second repository, the testing repository, again test and verification repository. And this repository is connected to your testing stage. And so after you promote it, Yacht sees that there is a new version and you can install it on testing. And since we want to have our repositories clean and small, we don't copy it, but we move it. And to not confuse Yum about having an RPM installed that it doesn't see in a repository, we also connect the dev stage to the testing repository, so it sees the RPM again that it has installed. And so this is just to not confuse Yum. And if you test it again and do all your system checks and everyone is still happy with this build, you promote it to the production repository, and we just reused our global repository for this. And again, since we copy, we do not copy but move, we also connect the global repository to everything. And for me, having this kind of infrastructure is obviously good because we can skip the Maven release process. This is you can easily automate this, but really this was for me a victory for the DevOps mindset because the first iteration we built with development and operations together, and this package promotion pipeline was built by a development team, and they really also thought that the Maven release process was crap, and they decided to do something about it. And basically, we just had to enable them to do it. And for me, this is really one of the benefits of the way we were building, or we are building our deployment automation, that we are doing it together, which enables everyone to help make it better still. So I already said this. We have this Nexus repository, and everyone who is building a Java application probably knows what Nexus or all the other artifact repositories out there are. And we also open sourced our plugin that lets you access Nexus as a Yum repository. This is really handy stuff because everything that you can do with Nexus in regard to staging and everything, you have the same view but in Yum repositories. So definitely recommended to check this out. We're not finished. with this, and I could go on and on and on about what we already changed and what we are still changing, but I want to briefly touch some things that we still consider that we are still of what we are sure that we have to change. The one thing that we really struggle with is that this having a shared infrastructure or having dedicated infrastructures. Like Tim told about VUGA, they all have dedicated infrastructure. So the team decides what its monitoring tool is and how they deploy, and they just build it and they are happy with it. And the other approach is that you build a shared infrastructure. For example, this package promotion pipeline, you exactly solve this one and then solve this little problem about scaling. And then you have one shared infrastructure that everyone can use. And basically we do both. And of course, having dedicated infrastructure is good because it gets you fast. But it's also not so good because a lot of people have to solve each and every problem all over again. And it's really a struggle to get to the point where you build an infrastructure that really scales for 20 teams, for 20 development teams like we have, for example. So we do both, and we struggle with it because usually the teams that go the fastest just leave the shared infrastructure behind, and so a lot of problems get solved very slowly because the fastest moving teams just go for their own infrastructure. So for us as a company, this is really an issue that we are still struggling with. And another part is we are relying a lot of stuff that is built into the distribution, like RPM packaging and the way Yum works, and how the kickstart process works, how what the bugs in Anaconda during the kickstart is, for example. And currently we have to work around a lot of these issues. So who is deploying the Tomcat examples application to their live system? We also don't want to do this, but the package you get, just they come with the example applications, and this so we repackage the Tomcat because we don't want to have this on our production system, and we also have to configure the Tomcat by another RPM package, and of course the Tomcat package is configured so the example applications run. So this is also an issue that we are struggling with, but we are working on this because we want to make the Linux distribution better, because in my book there is no company that wants to deploy the example configuration to the live server. So this doesn't really make sense in an enterprise world to have such a package. And I don't want to work around this, but I want to change the way this is packaged. And this also is a struggle to get there because we are RPM based, then there's Red Hat, and then there's SUSE, and well, we'll see. Yeah, working on it. So to wrap it up, after 2.5 years of migrating our platform, we really invested a lot. Mainly, the most thing that we invested in is the mindset that we were having while working together. Right now we are all more or less pulling in the same direction. We are not that divided anymore. What I'm really happy that we have today at Immobilien Scout is, for example, operational thinking and in development. So our development knows that it's not only best for us, but best for them to get to a decoupled application that you just can switch on and off, and there's no hassle with it. And we are doing Kanban and operations. I'm also happy about this because this really gets you a lot of transparency. This enables you or enables us to work together much better than we did before, when we were nicely siloed in development and in operations. And as I said, open sourcing is great. I love it, and I would recommend to, if your company has an issue with open sourcing your software, try to change it, because you as engineers, you as developers, you as admins, this helps you a lot. Open sourcing your ideas, talking about your ideas, I would strongly recommend that you change your company culture so this is possible. And for us, these were real game changers in the way we were approaching our deployment, talking about this, getting feedback, and also getting the feedback like, I can't tell you why, but I think this is a bad idea and I feel it in my guts that this won't work. This is a good feedback to get, and it's a good feedback because it lets you really think hard about, is this the right solution? And you really think about the best way of solving your problems, and not just assuming that this will work or assuming that this sure is a good idea, but you verify that it's a good idea. And for me as an engineer, this is good practice. So, thanks a lot. It's already very late, but I would just love to have a discussion about this. So if you have any more questions, feel free to ask. If every one of you has an answer to this, please answer. If you think an answer that is given needs something to add, feel free. So let's discuss.
Is there a simple way to roll back one version in all this stuff?
Yeah, well, yes and no.
In case you promote up to the live version and then anything breaks,
yeah,
you have to go back. Is it possible with a button?
Yeah, there are several ways that you can do, but from a conceptual point of view, we want to roll forward. So in each case, if it is possible at all, fix the problem, roll forward. And don't build up this technical debt with downgrading and all this stuff. But sure, it's possible. What you can do is just call yum downgrade and you have the last version.
Okay.
Or you can go into your repository, delete all the versions that are crappy, except the one you want, create the repo again, delete all your machines, create it again, and it works again.
But a simple downgrade would push going back with all those dependencies to the last working version.
Yeah. Okay. So long that you don't call Yacht update again, then you will go back to the latest version, which is the whole point in this. We cut our repository so that the latest version that you depend on is always the right version. So there is no question what the right version should be. And so we always want to be latest rated in regard to the repositories to see. So if I had to do it, I would try everything to roll forward. Or come to a point again where the latest that the system sees is just what you want. For example, deleting and then recreating. So, but yeah, it's possible. Okay, you go first.
How do you deal with database migration, schema changes, just adding data to the database or changing configuration in the database or whatever you have, you always go, okay, but this kind, it's not a package and it's not a config for the server. So.
Yeah, good question because it's hard to answer. basically in this idea, we currently don't touch database deployment. What we, at least not inside of the database, but creating a new MySQL version is just naming the server in our config SVN, and then it's there, right? But deploying the application schema, you know this very well. One strategy is to have the application care for this. And so each time you deploy an application, it migrates the database to where it needs it.
Depends on the problem. What you try to solve with the Yacht thing, because you maybe have to shut some other services down while this is migrating, or migrate these services first before you migrate the database because they depend on the data scheme, whatever.
Yeah, there are several answers to this. One is this. You won't get this complexity to work in this fashion if you want to do continuous delivery or continuous deployment. So if you're in a continuous deployment setup, what you do is you add to your schema, then you deploy your application that can deal with both versions, roll it out to everything, and then you do the migration, and then you roll out the substract, or then you change the schema again to the target state that you want. The application can handle this, and then you roll that out, and then you roll out a new application that just deletes all the old stuff from it, depending on the old schema. So the one, I think, very successful strategy is to solve complexity in the right spot. And in my book, the how to migrate the database schema is not a concern of the deployment. Or the complexity shouldn't go there. It's much more easier, maybe you can disagree, that the application is far better suited to do it. Or another way to do it is for a legacy application, we are using db-deploy to migrate our database schemas, and since db-deploy is only concerned about the database schema, applying this to a lot of systems, we wrote a wrapper around db-deploy to work fast. And there you have migration scripts that the deployment also deploys to your systems, and by that migrate them. But in any case, you need to be able to either roll backward or roll forward again. But I think the complexity shouldn't be the concern of the deployment itself. So this would be my answer.
And for us, it's important anyways to have a zero downtime deployment. Of course, otherwise the continuous delivery doesn't make any sense for us. So, and there you have the backward compatibility for the database anyway. So it makes it much easier to divorce the database deployment from all the automatic stuff. So you can deploy it any time you like. The database admins want it, and afterwards you can start deploying the new release. Of course, the new release needs a new database, but the old release doesn't work with the.
My problem with this thing is that you then decouple, like with a version number for your app and you have a version number for your database scripts, wherever they're lying around. Then it's somehow not coupled anymore when you do it like separate. I like this is the version, and the deployment scripts are part of my app, and the deployment process takes care of it that they're in place at the right time. So otherwise you have doing it manually somehow.
Yeah, so this db-deploy stuff is also automated, but for the core application is really old and it's crap. Right? From an engineering standpoint, you wouldn't write your application like this anymore. So just adding more and more complexity and responsibility to this stuff will just break. So we don't even try it. Right? To just add more complexity to it, to make it more simple, to make it more decoupled, to modularize it. We do this, of course, else we just can stop adding features to it if we don't do it, because then the we just add bugs and not features. And I'm pointing to Florian so much because he also develops applications for Immobilien Scout 24, and the contract that we have with your application is that the application takes care of the database migration.
So basically we do it over several versions and feature switches in the code, but luckily enough the products that we do are not that complex and not that big scale, so there it is possible, but there are several problems and pitfalls that you can have with that.
Yeah, my question was more or less the same. Obviously, it seems like there is no magic bullet for relate the deployment and the data migration. The question was how you know that you should promote one version. Do you have integration tests? How many servers do you need to test?
There are two answers. One is the delivery pipeline that we have is automated, and so there is one business decision in this, and this is when to go live with a new version. So either because you have to time it for some marketing stuff you have to do, or because you don't think this is a viable set of changes from a business perspective, and we just have to have this additional feature before it makes sense for us from a business standpoint to go live. So this is a business decision, but everything from deployment to development and deployment to testing is automatic. So if we get a new version, we build it, we deploy it on development. On the CI, you already have the unit tests. On the development stage, you have your first integration and systems test. And if you pass that, you promote it to the next stage in the pipeline. Try it again, test it again. You do manual tests on it. You do whatever your process as a company is to come to the conclusion, great work, let's go live with it. You do this on testing, and then business decides go live. Then we hit the button again, which has the label go live. And then we promote it again and call Yacht.
Do you mean some kind of, if you need to do a small change in one service, did you feel that go to all that process is kind of so hard or too much? Well, if you have some small change that you find that you do some wrong thing on a small part of the systems, for me it seems like all the process is kind of too much. But
well, I think you could argue if you have one box, this may be too much. But if I would say you can argue about this, right? If this one box is your business, then I think you want to go fast and you want to iterate a lot about your business ideas, and you want to go live as fast as possible so you can measure the impact on your revenue from the change that you just developed. So having an infrastructure that allows you just to change, deploy, and inspect your change, I would argue you need this, because it changes the way that you develop your application and how you develop your business. But this is arguable, right? But in our case, we have shy of 1,000 machines. So for us, there is no other way than to do it this way. But I would argue if you have more than a handful of systems, I think there's no excuse not to do it. And I would also argue that there is good business reason to do it with just one machine, if this is your business. I don't know how you see this. Okay. Questions?
is there a main reason that you use TeamCity as integration server instead of other integration server like Hudson or Jenkins?
Yeah, we use Jenkins, we use TeamCity, we used to use Krusch control, but
or is it the first choice and it works, and you don't have to compare with other servers?
it's, I would say it's like always. If you know a product, if you have used it, and if you see that it works, you use it. And if you're a bigger company, if you can buy professional support for a product, this also helps you decide for this product. But in the end, TeamCity works very well for us, but we also use Jenkins as a CI server.
What we really loved is the pre-tested commit feature that was not available on other CIs at that point, and that was worth the money. And it's a good tool. So I see it more from the ops side, but it's really comfortable and scales good and it's not so expensive. So it's worth the money in my opinion. But it's not open source. So I love open source in general. Yeah.
Okay,
that's why we're using Jenkins. Does this answer your question?
Sorry. You were like, these were like evolutionary steps you described here. Is there any like evolutionary step which you would like to take, but you think maybe is too risky? Because I hear you talking about like legacy software, like some old stuff in there, but is there something that you would like, if you could scrap out this one, this is what you would come up with?
If I had a magic wand?
No, not
yes,
only.
then I would do it.
You're talking about this internally also, like you would like to get rid of this because then that would like resolve all to.
If you started with Greenfield today, you would do a lot of application other way, and you would decouple it much more. And these are the lessons learned for the last 10 years. But we can't start on the Greenfield for our core application. So this is no magic wish there.
Yeah. Which is nice, but you said also you have fast teams, and sometimes fast teams then start to like, okay, we take the old stuff as a kind, we put an API around this, and we don't change this anymore, and then we start like building small apps from this. Is it something which happens in your company also?
All the new stuff we develop, we do this way.
Okay,
There's no more development for the core application for new features. We're just evolving, but no new features always coupled and with a strong API connected.
But I would also say, or would add to this, that it really, if you're doing an evolution or a revolution, really depends on your point of view. Right?
Okay,
so
yeah, sure.
I would argue, from the point of view of our data center provider, we are engaged in an epic revolution, right? Getting root on our systems, changing the pseudo rights we have by ourselves, deploying as root, deploying RPMs on it, taking away the responsibility for mounting the file shares, and so on, integrating in the kickstart of the virtual machines. I bet for them this is an all-out revolution. Right? And as I said at the beginning, we were very much divided on what approach to take. And so I know to some colleagues this amounted more to a revolution than an evolution. But the magic wand stuff, of course, there is stuff that if I could, I would just change it. So, for example, our core application, if we just could decouple our search or expose from the application, we would have 80% of our traffic on an application that just rocks from an operational standpoint, where you don't have to wait 30 minutes to shut down it so you can maintain it and then fire it up again.
Yeah.
Just laugh. But it's hard. But as I said, we're giving it a third try. And maybe it's not a revolution, but getting to the point where you can deploy our core application with RPMs, we will start with this next week, working on this. And there are really a lot of issues in your application, in your infrastructure, in your deployment tool, and what you have that you have to change and adapt to this task, because right now these are all these nicely decoupled applications. Then you have this many hundred web servers and backend servers that make up the core application. Then you have suddenly, if you want to update one application, you have to touch 100 systems. Now, if you want to update one application, we have to touch 10 systems, 20. So, yeah, this will also be a revolution, because we need to change a lot in our application for this to work. Questions? So, thanks a lot.
Yeah, so thank you for coming. Thank you, Maureen Scout.
You're welcome.
Ingmar and
please drink up the beer. You managed to finish the brain cells, but if you want, use it.
They already paid. Yeah, there are a lot of people here tonight, and you're probably all insane, or somebody told you about the group. We also have other channels to communicate, which is a Google group and Twitter. If you just go and say, follow me, or follow the group, it's going to follow you as well. And in the user group, because people send questions there, and I mean, you got hopefully nice talks today with some other guys you didn't know before, hopefully, and you can do the same using the Google group. And yeah, stay tuned, there's going to be another one soon, meetups. Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot.